On Thanksgiving, my own son stood up at my dinner table, told me to just sign and shut up, and then slapped me across the face. What he didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment for years. One folder. That's all it took to change everything. If you've ever felt dismissed, disrespected, or like your silence was expected, this story is for you. My name is Elaine Morton, and I've spent most of my life making sure everyone else felt at home. You know the type. The one who keeps the traditions going long after the kids stop noticing them. The one who remembers who likes what in their mashed potatoes, who folds the napkins, just so who makes the gravy from scratch because the packet kind just doesn't taste like family. That was me. Still is, I guess, in some ways. I'm 59 years old now, and I live alone in a weathered farmhouse on the edge of a sleepy town in New Hampshire. The porch sags a little on the left, the radiator hisses in the morning like it's angry at being awake, and the kitchen window fogs up beautifully when I boil cider in late November. It's not grand, but it's mine. I chose this house after the divorce. Simple quiet, far enough from Boston to be forgotten, and close enough to maple trees to feel alive. I didn't leave the marriage in bitterness. I left because I wanted peace. After 34 years with Martin, I realized that silence can be a sanctuary, but only if it's yours. So I let him keep the lake house timeshare, the bigger house, even the china cabinet I'd inherited from my grandmother. I walked away with my books, my cast-iron skillet, and a sense of self I hadn't heard from in decades. It wasn't much, but it was finally mine. Martin, of course, landed on his feet, as men like him always do. Within a year, he married Renee, a real estate agent who's young enough to call me ma'am and old enough to know not to. She has one of those tight smiles that don't touch the eyes and a way of saying my name like it's part of a sales pitch. Elaine Morton, she once said at a birthday party, like she was checking a name off a list she didn't want to write. But I digress. We have 2 children. Darren is the eldest, now 40, married to Liz, a kind woman who always brings her own Tupperware. They have a teenage son, Caleb, who still hugs me like I matter. Nina, our youngest, lives in Arizona. She left the day after her college graduation and has been flying further ever since. She sends cards on birthdays, typed, not handwritten. And once mailed me a cactus in December with a note that read, "Thought you could use some green." I haven't seen her in person in 4 years. Despite it all, I still host Thanksgiving. 32 years running. I've roasted turkeys in blizzards and heat waves, arranged pine cones into centerpieces, and once made a full dinner using only the stovetop after the oven died mid-bake. I've ironed linens, polished silver, and stored wine bottles behind the laundry soap so no one would see how many I'd opened before dinner started. There's something about that Thursday in November. It pulls me back into a rhythm I can't quite break. A part of me still hopes they'll show up differently. That maybe just once the warmth won't come solely from the oven. This year I'd started preparations early. Grocery store Tuesday morning, chopping by afternoon. By Wednesday, the cranberry sauce was cooling in mason jars, and I'd tucked tiny notes under each napkin. Just a habit from when the kids were little, when I'd write things like, "I'm proud of you," or, "You make the room brighter." No one reads them now. Still, I do it. At 3:42 p.m. on Wednesday, my phone lit up with Darren's name. It always startles me how abrupt his calls are. No warm-up, no build, just straight into logistics. "Hey, Mom," he said, breezy as ever. "Just calling to confirm for tomorrow. Liz is bringing that squash thing you love, and I'll grab rolls from Brinton's. Dinner at 4, I said. Same as always? Yep. Oh. And Dad said he might swing by a little early. Something he needs you to sign something about the lake house. Just a quick thing." I paused, my fingers sticky with sweet potato mash. "Sign what?" He chuckled. "I don't know. Paperwork. Just some property stuff, I think. Nothing serious. He said it's about that lakeside land." I wiped my hands on a towel, my eyes drifting to the list I'd pinned to the fridge. Carrots, cider, whipped cream, Brussels sprouts. No mention of contracts. No place for confrontation. "Tell him 3 o'clock, I said. No earlier." "Sure thing. Thanks, Mom." There was a moment's silence on the line. I thought maybe he'd say something else. Ask how I was. But then he added, "Oh, and Nina's not coming. Work conflict. She sends love. Of course, I replied. Give her my best. After the call ended, I didn't move for a while. Just stood there in my quiet kitchen, the afternoon light beginning to tilt, filling the room with that pale silver hue that only November seems to know how to pour. I glanced at the pie crusts waiting to be filled, the stack of dishes, the note cards under the napkins. And I felt it. Low in my stomach, quiet and certain. Something wasn't right. I've hosted enough Thanksgivings to know the difference between a gathering and a setup. Darren's tone, Martin's timing, Nina's absence. It all felt rehearsed, like a scene I hadn't been given the script to. The lake house. That word alone tightened something in my chest. We'd bought it during the best year of our marriage when we still believed in summers and scraped knees and dockside laughter. I hadn't been back in years, but I remembered everything. Martin wanted me to sign something. Darren said it was nothing serious. I've heard those words before. This time I was listening differently. This time I was still setting the table, but not just for them. I was setting it for the woman I'd become. The one who doesn't sign anything without reading the fine print. The one who remembers everything they've forgotten. The one who, this year, might finally take her place at the head of the table not as a hostess, but as a person who will not be pushed. At exactly 2:59 p.m., my doorbell rang. Martin always was punctual when it served him. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, took a deep breath, and opened the door. There he stood just like always. Polished shoes, pressed overcoat, the same silk scarf I gave him for Christmas 15 years ago, now repurposed as part of his curated elegance. He smiled like a man arriving at a closing not at the home he once shared with the mother of his children. Elaine, he said, stepping forward as if the threshold still belonged to him. You look, well. I stepped back to let him in. 3 o'clock on the dot. You haven't changed. He gave a soft chuckle like a man who believes you're still charmed by him. I led him into the parlor where the fire was already crackling. He took his usual spot on the leather armchair like muscle memory, his eyes scanning the room the way he used to at open houses, taking inventory. You said you had something for me to sign. I said, choosing the armrest of the couch instead of sitting across from him. Ah, yes, he said, reaching into his leather portfolio. Just a small thing, really. The developers need sign-offs from all stakeholders before the lake house parcel can proceed. It's nothing complex, just a quick formality. I didn't move. Developers. He hesitated, then unfolded a thin packet of documents and placed them carefully on the coffee table between us. They're looking at turning the area into a resort cluster, golf spa, that sort of thing. High-end. It's an excellent offer. I picked up the top page. It had legal jargon layered like sediment. Clauses, signatures, bolded subsections. My name was printed at the top. No mention of my consent. Just my compliance. You've already agreed to this, I asked. We're in the final talks, he said smoothly. Darren's aware. The lawyers said you'd only need to initial in a few spots. Nothing binding until all signatures are collected. So this is a decision already made, I said, and now it's my turn to rubber stamp it. He raised an eyebrow. It's a good deal, Elaine. You haven't been to the lake house in years. That doesn't mean I've forgotten it. His mouth twitched, but he said nothing. The lake house wasn't just real estate. It was where we took the kids every summer for 15 years, where Darren learned to fish, where Nina wrote her first poem on the back of a cereal box. Where I first realized our marriage was dying quietly, like leaves turning in late September. We bought that house 10 years into our marriage. Together. We built it with weekends with sweat, with scraped knees and mismatched curtains. It was the one place that still felt untouched by the divorce. I'm not signing anything today, I said. Martin leaned back, unfazed. Of course, take your time. The sooner the better. I didn't offer him coffee. I didn't ask about Renee. I just let the silence sit between us like a third guest. By the time Darren's car pulled into the driveway, Martin had already excused himself with a polite nod and a folder left behind in case I felt like reviewing. I placed it on the hallway table and didn't touch it again that day. Darren walked in holding a pie box in one hand and a tray of cider in the other, followed by Liz and Caleb. Liz gave me a quick hug, the kind that says thank you and I'm sorry and we're just doing our best all at once. Caleb went straight for the den to check if the board games were still where I kept them. They were. Everything was casual, familiar, fine on the surface. But I could tell Darren had been briefed. His eyes flicked to the hallway table, then quickly away. No mention of the documents, no mention of Martin's visit, just quiet glances and overly cheerful chatter. I brought Liz's butternut squash bake, he said. Thought we'd put it in the oven to warm. Of course, I said. You know the way. As we unloaded the food, I felt the tiniest pang of memory. Thanksgivings past, when they'd bring casseroles with pride, not as peace offerings. When they used to ask where the spoons were instead of assuming they knew better than me. Then came the knock. Nina. I hadn't expected to see her. I hadn't even dared hope. She stood at the door in a tailored coat and city boots, a carefully practiced expression on her face. Hi, Mom, she said, kissing my cheek. Behind her stood a man in a gray wool suit carrying a leather briefcase. This is Colin, she added. My partner? I nodded, pretending not to notice the firm handshake the clipboard tucked under his arm, the way his eyes scanned the room like a realtor assessing square footage. Partner? I asked, one eyebrow raised. In business, Nina clarified quickly. He's just here for the holiday. Of course he was. I watched as Colin chatted with Darren and Liz like they'd met before. Maybe they had. Maybe they'd all met without me. As I stood by the kitchen island, basting the turkey for the third time that day, I realized something unsettling. There was a rhythm to their movements, a familiarity between them that didn't include me, like I'd walked into a dinner that had already been discussed in group chats I wasn't part of. Colin opened a bottle of wine and poured it like he knew where the glasses were. Nina pulled out papers from her tote bag, slipped them into her coat pocket when she thought I wasn't looking. It wasn't just Thanksgiving anymore. It was a boardroom. And I was being managed. Dinner was always my domain. I suppose that's something I carried with pride longer than I should have. I knew how to set a table to calm a storm. I could season green beans to distract from tension-fold napkins in a way that said, we're okay even when we weren't. I did it year after year, even when my marriage cracked, even when the children grew quiet, even when my heart wasn't entirely in it. I cooked, I hosted, I carried. This year I set out the good china. Ivory plates rimmed with faded gold my mother gave me when I first married. I tied cloth napkins with thin twine and slipped a sprig of rosemary in each. The smell, for some reason, always made me feel steady. I pulled the turkey from the oven just as the room began to fill with the voices of people I no longer fully recognized. Darren helped me carry the serving dishes to the table. Liz placed wine glasses at each seat, and Nina leaned over Caleb, whispering something that made him smile. Colin, still practically a stranger, moved around the room like a man who'd already been given permission. As everyone settled into their places, I stood at the head of the table for a moment. My place. The place where I had carved every Thanksgiving turkey for over 3 decades. I took the knife, let my eyes scan the table, and tried, truly tried, to pretend this was just another holiday. We passed dishes, compliments were given. Liz asked for the recipe to the stuffing which I'd given her 5 times before. Darren refilled my glass without asking. Nina barely touched her plate. Colin nodded politely at everything. Then Darren cleared his throat. We've got a bit of exciting news, he said, his voice bright forced. We've accepted an opportunity to relocate. I looked up. Relocate where to France, Liz chimed in. Paris, specifically. Darren was offered a partner role at a firm there. It's a huge step up. My heart skipped, though I didn't know why. I nodded slowly. That's quite a leap. It's the right move, Darren said. For our family. Better schools for Caleb. Better work-life balance. And we're using the proceeds from the lake house sale to help buy property there. Silence. I blinked. The what? Darren shifted. The lake house? Once it sells? Between Dad's contacts and the developer's offer, we'll have what we need to start clean. I looked across the table. No one met my gaze. I haven't agreed to sell the lake house. Liz spoke softly. We figured you just hadn't had a chance to review the papers, Martin said. I raised a hand gently. Martin doesn't speak for me. And this isn't about paperwork. This is about all of you deciding without me what should be done with something I still legally own. It's not like we're cutting you out, Darren said. We're involving you. You're informing me, I corrected. After the fact. There was an edge in my voice I hadn't heard in years. The kind of quiet firmness that doesn't need to rise to be felt. Nina set her fork down. We just thought, Colin and I, that is, that if part of the funds could support our startup, I repeated, a consulting firm. We're developing a platform for financial literacy and digital transitions. I turned toward her. And you were hoping the lake house would finance your next chapter? She blushed, glanced at Colin, then said, It's not just for us. We're building something that could benefit everyone. Everyone. A word they loved to use when they wanted to make selfishness sound like community. You're building it with someone I met an hour ago, I said. In my house. At my table. Mom, please don't make this a thing. Nina sighed. It's just a house. No, I replied. It's not just a house. It's where I rocked both of you to sleep when you had fevers. Where we spent our first Christmas after your dad lost his job. Where your father and I sat on the dock and decided we'd try one more year. Darren leaned forward, his expression tight. You haven't been there in over 6 years. And yet it's the only place I still feel like I belong. No one said anything. The table, once buzzing, had gone completely still. What I don't understand, I continued, is how none of you thought to ask. Not one phone call. Not one, Mom, what do you think? Just assumptions. Decisions made in rooms I wasn't invited into. Liz tried to offer a placating smile. Elaine, we didn't mean for it to feel like this. That's the problem, I said. You didn't feel anything at all. Colin cleared his throat. Elaine, I assure you this is a solid opportunity. You'd still benefit. Everyone would. I looked at him flatly. You don't get to explain my legacy to me. And you don't get to benefit from something you never built. He looked down finally. Darren exhaled loudly like he'd had enough. Mom, this is getting dramatic. You're making this harder than it needs to be. And you're making it easier than it should be, I answered. Because for you it's just a signature. For me it's a burial. Everyone froze. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I simply stood, walked to the kitchen, and refilled my wine glass. Behind me, the conversation picked up again, carefully, awkwardly. But I wasn't listening. Because in that moment, I realized something I had never admitted out loud. They didn't want my opinion. They wanted my permission. And they were hoping I wouldn't notice the difference. The dishes had been cleared, the pie half-eaten, and the candles were burning down to little puddles of wax. Caleb had gone off to the living room with a book. The adults were lingering around the table, each nursing a glass of something stronger than cider. It should have been the winding down of a lovely family evening. But it wasn't. The air was tight. Everyone was pretending they hadn't just cornered me into signing away a piece of my life, and I was pretending I hadn't noticed. I sat quietly at the end of the table, my hands folded in my lap. It was the same seat I'd always taken at Thanksgiving. The hostess seat, the carver's seat, the one who kept the rhythm of the evening moving. But this time I wasn't carving anything. I was watching, listening, measuring the weight of their words. Darren was bouncing his leg under the table. I knew that tick. He was getting impatient. Mom, he said suddenly too loudly, let's go ahead and wrap this up all right. Colin has the documents ready. We can notarize and scan them before we leave. I looked at him, my face unreadable. Wrap what up? He blinked. The paperwork, the lake house documents. I said I wouldn't be signing anything today, I replied. Calm, cold. He let out a scoffing sound. It's a simple set of forms. Dad's already done his part. Nina and I are aligned. It's just your signature left. You've had all afternoon to think it over." "Ah," I said softly. "So dinner was a grace period." He didn't answer. Colin cleared his throat. "Elaine, if it helps, we've had legal review. It's all very clean. You'd be releasing title, yes, but still entitled to your share. You're not losing anything. Just streamlining the process." "Streamlining?" "That word," Nina added. "We're not trying to pressure you, Mom, but this is time-sensitive. The buyers want confirmation this week." I turned toward her. "And what if I say no?" She blinked like she hadn't considered that was even an option. "You wouldn't. You don't even use the house. Not using something doesn't mean I don't love it." Darren leaned forward, hands on the table, voice sharp. "This is ridiculous." "No," I said, "what's ridiculous is treating your mother like a signature machine." "You're overreacting," he muttered. "You've made decisions about my property, my legacy, without my involvement. That's not overreaction. That's betrayal." His chair scraped loudly as he stood up. "This is exactly what Dad warned us about. You always make things emotional. You stall. You manipulate." I stayed seated. "I'm asking you one last time," he said, jaw clenched. "Don't drag this out. Just sign and shut up." Silence. Not a breath in the room. Not even from Liz, who had been hovering near the kitchen entryway with her wine glass frozen mid-sip. The words hung there like smoke. Ugly, heavy, and familiar in a way that cut deep. I looked up at him slowly. My son. The boy I used to rock back to sleep during thunderstorms. The teenager I defended when his math teacher said he lacked focus. The man I now barely recognized. "What did you say?" I asked, my voice steady as stone. "You heard me," he snapped. "Just sign and shut." Before the last syllable left his mouth, his arm moved. It happened so fast. The back of his hand came across my face. Not hard enough to knock me down, but enough to snap my head to the side and draw a collective gasp from every corner of the room. Liz gasped and dropped her glass, which shattered near her feet. Nina's face went pale. Even Colin had the decency to look horrified. The sting bloomed instantly across my cheek. My skin burned, but not with shame, not with embarrassment, with clarity. I reached up and gently touched the red flush he'd left. My hand didn't shake. My eyes didn't tear. I simply nodded once. Then I looked Darren straight in the eye and said in the calmest voice I could muster, "Thank you." He looked confused. Angry. "What thank you?" I repeated. "Because now everyone sees you the way I've seen you for years." No one moved. I pushed my chair back slowly. The sound echoed louder than his shouting. Then I walked past him, slowly, deliberately, and opened the cabinet in the hallway. From behind a stack of placemats and a holiday table runner, I pulled out a dark brown leather folder, worn at the edges, zip closure, clean, quiet. I had placed it there 3 weeks ago, just in case. When I turned back, the room was still paralyzed. I walked to the head of the table, the seat where Martin used to sit, the one Darren had claimed earlier that night like a crown, and I placed the folder right in the center. "What is that?" Nina asked, her voice a whisper. I looked down at the folder and ran my fingers along the edge. "This," I said, my voice low, almost kind, "is the part of the evening you didn't rehearse." No one breathed. I didn't open it. Not yet. Let them feel it first. Let them sit with the knowing that I was no longer the woman they thought would crumble. That whatever came next, I was ready. And they weren't. For a moment, the room felt weightless. Not calm. No, not even close. But suspended. Like the house itself was holding its breath. The folder sat in the middle of the table, not flashy, not loud, but utterly commanding. The kind of presence only something well-prepared and long-held can carry. It was the only thing in the room that felt solid. Everything else. Darren's red face, Nina's shocked eyes, Colin's frozen expression, felt as brittle as the glass Liz had dropped. I took my time. They had forced me into rush decisions for years. This time they would wait. With steady fingers, I unzipped the leather seam and pulled out the first document. It was just 3 pages. Cream-colored clean. The kind of paper that speaks louder than people ever can. I slid it across the table, turned toward Darren. "This," I said softly, "is the deed to the lake house. Sole ownership transferred to me 3 years ago. Your father signed it during the week his company was being audited. You remember that chaos, don't you? When he kept saying he was too busy to answer calls?" Darren didn't move. His assistant at the time, Maya Reese, brought it to him in his office. He signed it without reading, assuming it was a routine trust update. Daniel Weeks notarized it. Colin leaned forward. "That's impossible. The house is still listed under joint title in the public records." "It is," I agreed. "On the surface, the transfer was processed through a land use clause in our divorce agreement, buried deep in footnote 3 of Exhibit C. Took my attorney months to dig it up. But it's legal. It's recorded. It's binding," Liz whispered. "So, the lake house belongs only to you." "Yes," I said, looking her directly in the eye. "It has for 3 years." Nina's voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell us? I didn't think I needed to," I answered. "Because I didn't think any of you would try to sell it out from under me." I reached into the folder again, this time for the thicker file. It made a muted thud when I set it on the table. The sound made Colin wince. "This is a forensic audit," I said. "I had it conducted quietly over the course of a year after Martin began pulling strange amounts from our accounts before the divorce finalized." Darren shook his head. "What you're saying, Dad? What stole money I'm saying?" I replied calmly. "He laundered it, through shell companies, set up in Delaware and Reno, even one in the British Virgin Islands. He called them consulting costs. But no services were ever rendered. The money went in clean, came out cloudy." Colin took a breath to speak, then thought better of it. I continued. "He used your names, both of you, in some of the filings. Passive mentions. Nothing that would directly implicate you, but enough to shield the transfers under family assets. That's part of why I never brought it up. I didn't want either of you caught in his shadow." Nina paled. "Wait. My name is in this?" "Yes," I said gently. "So is Darren's. But only in passing. You're not liable, not unless you keep helping him cover it up." Darren stared down at his hands. His mouth opened, then closed. I could see the war happening behind his eyes. Between guilt and denial. Between the son I raised and the man he'd become. "You think I'm lying?" I asked, not accusingly, but plainly. "Call Maya. She left the company 6 months ago. She'll talk now." Colin finally found his voice. "Elaine, if this is true, if you had all this, why bring it out now?" I turned to him, and for once I didn't look at him as Nina's advisor or Martin's lackey. I looked at him like a man who'd walked into the wrong house with the wrong assumptions. "Because I was willing to walk away quietly," I said. "I was willing to let Martin keep his illusions and let you all live your lives. But then you tried to turn me into a signature. You turned my home into a boardroom. You turned Thanksgiving into a transaction." I stood slowly. "I didn't bring this folder to make a scene," I said. "I brought it because I knew eventually someone would mistake my silence for surrender." Everyone was silent. "I'm not here for revenge," I added. "I'm here for clarity." Liz finally spoke. Her voice was low. "You really did all this alone?" "I did," I said, "because I had to." Darren looked up. There was something almost childlike in his face now. Confusion. Regret. Or maybe just the realization that he'd never really seen me. "You're not the woman I thought you were," he said. I smiled. "No, I'm not. But I always was." I reached for the folder and slowly zipped it closed. The sound felt final. Not dramatic, just done. "Whatever happens next," I said, "happens on my terms." I looked at each of them. Darren, Nina, Colin, Liz. Not with anger, but with a kind of sad understanding. They hadn't meant to destroy me. They just didn't think I was worth considering. This isn't revenge, I said. This is revelation. And with that, I turned and walked out of the room, not because I was defeated, but because I had already won. I always thought peace would feel like silence, like the kind of quiet you get in the early morning before the world stirs. Just you, the soft tick of a clock, maybe a bird in the distance. But that morning, as I pulled out of my driveway with a single suitcase and a folder of signed documents on the passenger seat, I learned something else. Peace feels like control, not dominance, not power, just knowing you're no longer at the mercy of people who think you don't matter. I drove to Joanne's office with the windows cracked just enough to feel the November chill on my face. The sky was gray, but I didn't mind. It matched the tone of everything I was ready to let go of. Joanne Reed had always been a woman of details. Back in college, she could out-argue our professors and still remember your birthday. Life took her into law and me into motherhood, but we stayed in touch. Christmas cards, condolence notes, the occasional long phone call after a glass of wine. When things with Martin began to unravel for the second time, quietly financially, she was the only one I trusted to help me prepare, not just protect. She met me at the door with no fanfare, just a soft hand on my arm and a glance toward my cheek. "Still sore?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, it's already fading." We walked down the hallway of her converted farmhouse office. Exposed beams, heavy wooden doors, a fireplace that always smelled like eucalyptus. It didn't feel like a law office. It felt like a place women went when they were ready to stop explaining themselves. Her assistant had already placed the documents neatly on the table. I recognized the folders. The same ones I had helped color code 6 weeks ago. At the time, I hadn't been sure I'd need them. Now I was sure of everything. Joanne sat across from me and opened the first folder. This, she said, is the full transfer into the Morton Legacy Trust. We're moving the lake house, your remaining retirement accounts, and the 2 brokerage portfolios into the trust name. From this moment forward, those assets no longer legally belong to you. They belong to the trust, and no one can touch them. I took the pen, signed once, then again, then again. With every stroke, I felt a weight slide off my shoulders. Next came the restraining orders. Standard civil protection filings, Joanne said, passing them across. Against Martin and Darren. They bar physical contact, verbal threats, and legal intimidation. The sheriff's department will deliver them by 10 a.m. tomorrow. I flipped through the language carefully. I wasn't afraid of them, but I was done giving them access to me. I don't want Caleb to be affected by this, I said. He won't be, she reassured me. The orders specific to his father and grandfather. Not him. I nodded, then reached into my bag and pulled out the small USB drive I had sealed in a sandwich bag. I have something else. Joanne arched an eyebrow. More, a recording, I said. Made in my house, last week. She took the drive from my hand and plugged it into her computer without a word. It's Colin's voice. He was speaking to Nina. He didn't know I was close enough to hear. He was explaining that Martin had asked him to explore options, psychological ones. If I resisted the sale, they'd claim I was unstable, that I was forgetful, maybe even violent, enough to be declared unfit. Joanne's jaw tightened, and they thought that would hold up. They thought I wouldn't fight back. She clicked a few buttons, made a copy of the audio file, and began logging it into a digital evidence binder. "This changes things," she murmured. "A psychiatrist can't proceed without a request. That means someone, either Martin or Colin, was planning to manufacture a medical case." I sipped the tea she had placed on the table. Still warm. Jasmine, just like I liked it. "There's more," I said quietly. Colin referenced a doctor by name. Dr. Latimer. Said he was sympathetic to situations like this. Joanne didn't even pause. "We'll subpoena his license if it comes to that." We moved on to the final folder, the one I had tried not to think about. This, she said, placing it between us, is the whistleblower packet. If we send it, it goes to the SEC, the IRS, and the state attorney's office. It includes the audit, the recording the property transfer history, and a signed deposition from you, already pre-recorded. Are you ready to release it? I looked at the folder. I had once feared what would happen if people knew what Martin had done. Now I feared what would happen if I stayed quiet. Hold it for now, I said. Give him the chance to come clean. If he does, we walk away. If he doesn't, burn every bridge. Joanne gave me a small nod. That's fair. I'll keep everything secured under attorney-client protection. We signed a final confidentiality clause. The trust was activated. The restraining orders were filed. And just like that, I was no longer under anyone's legal shadow. As I packed up to leave, Joanne handed me an envelope. Inside was a check-in confirmation for the Rosewood Inn, a quiet little place on the edge of town. She'd booked it under my maiden name. Thought of everything as usual. I'm proud of you, she said. I'm proud of me too, I whispered. I drove straight there. Didn't go home. I didn't want the house to smell like what had just happened. I wanted neutral air, clean sheets, a window I didn't have to look over my shoulder near. The innkeeper handed me the key without asking for ID. Room 4, upstairs, corner view. I stepped inside, put my bag on the bed, locked the door. Then I sat by the window wrapped in a thick blanket and stared out at the late autumn landscape. I didn't think about Martin, or Darren, or the lake house, or the years they all had made me feel like the background. Instead, I thought about the trust, the protection, the fact that for the first time in my adult life, no one could take anything from me without my permission. And for the first time in decades, I exhaled and didn't feel like I owed the world an apology. The snow had started falling sometime around dawn, thick, soft flakes that blurred the edges of the world outside the inn window. I sat curled in an armchair by the radiator, a blanket wrapped around my legs. My second cup of coffee slowly going cold in my hands. The world outside was still. Inside I waited. For the storm I had set in motion to reach its second wave. At 9:03 a.m., my phone lit up with a simple message from Joanne. It's done. Orders delivered. Officers confirmed both parties compliant. No incident. A pause. Legal filing acknowledgments sent. Take a breath, Elaine. You're covered. I reread the message several times. The words didn't carry drama. No exclamation marks. Just calm, professional, final. I set the phone down on the windowsill and let the steam of my coffee warm my chin. They had been served. Darren would have opened the door to a sheriff in uniform, handing over an envelope he never thought would bear his name. Martin, likely in a robe, probably half believing it was a delivery mistake until he read the first few lines. Restraining orders, legal protections, assets shielded, no more access, no more manipulation, no more I'm just trying to help. And just like that, the calls began. The first voicemail from Darren was confused. Hey, Mom, I just got served with something. There's a court stamp and your name on it, and I'm not even sure what it means. I thought we were going to talk about this. He paused. You could hear him pacing, probably in the hallway somewhere near the kitchen where I used to wash dishes after Thanksgiving dinners. This isn't how we handle things. Call me, please, I didn't... 10 minutes later, a second message. I just spoke to Liz. She said you filed for asset protection. A trust. You transferred the house. Mom, come on. That's overkill. You're blowing this way out of proportion. Let's talk like adults. Then came the third. Short, harsh. I hope you're proud. You've just lit a match on your entire family. I didn't reply to that one either. Then Nina's voice appeared, softer, almost breathless like she'd been crying. Mom, I just found out. I didn't know about the trust or the restraining order or any of this. Darren's freaking out. Colin's furious. I feel like I'm losing all of you at once. Please, just tell me what you need. Please. I sat back and listened, not out of cruelty but clarity. This was what they didn't understand. It wasn't that I wanted them to suffer. It's that I wanted them to see what it's like when someone finally builds a boundary so solid no guilt can climb over it. Around 10:15 a.m. The calls slowed. For a little while the world was quiet again. I refilled my coffee, pulled the curtains open wider, and stared out at the snow-covered cars parked along the inn's lot. A couple walked past hand in hand, their cheeks red with cold. A delivery driver fumbled with boxes outside the cafe next door. The world was moving. I was still. Then came the final call of the day. One I didn't expect. Unknown number. Washington, D.C. Area code. I hesitated, then answered. This is Elaine Morton. A man's voice, formal and firm. Mrs. Morton, my name is John Wallace. I'm the chairman of the board at Arviston Pharmaceuticals. I apologize for the abrupt call. I said nothing. We've received a set of legal documents and supporting materials concerning Mr. Martin Turner, your former spouse. These materials include forensic audits, notarized asset transfers, and audio recordings of significant concern. Still, I stayed quiet. Before our board proceeds, we need to confirm two things. First, that you are the source of the documents, and second, that you are willing to affirm their authenticity under oath if necessary. I glanced at the folder still resting in my overnight bag. I am, I said calmly, and the contents. Are they true? They are. He hesitated. These documents will likely result in mandatory reporting to multiple regulatory agencies. There will be consequences. There should be. He cleared his throat. Then we will proceed with our own investigation. You may be contacted for follow-up testimony. I'll be ready. That was all. He hung up without saying goodbye. I stared at the phone in my hand. The silence that followed was heavier than anything they'd ever said to me. It was the silence of a structure collapsing. Quiet at first, then total. By mid-afternoon, the financial headlines were impossible to avoid. Turner resigns, from Arviston following whistleblower allegations. Former CFO faces SEC scrutiny over asset transfers and offshore holdings. Corporate golden boy faces reckoning at 64. I didn't read the articles. I didn't need to. I had lived the prologue. The rest was just footnotes. Instead, I returned to my window seat. The snow was falling heavier now. A pair of squirrels were digging through the flower bed out front noses, twitching tails flicking with impatience. And for the first time in years, my phone was completely silent. No requests, no ultimatums, no, "Can you sign this real quick?" I wasn't a supporting role anymore. I wasn't the keeper of the family image, the peacekeeper, the quiet one who always made room at the table, even for the people who never once made room for me. I was something else now. I was a woman they couldn't push anymore. And while they scrambled to understand how everything had shifted so fast, I sipped my coffee, watched the snow drift quietly down the glass, and smiled. Not because I'd won, but because I hadn't disappeared. I stayed at the inn for 5 days, long enough for the headlines to move on, long enough for the storm I had unleashed to settle into silence. No one knew where I was. That was the point. For the first time in decades, I didn't belong to anyone's schedule, anyone's idea of who I should be. I woke when I pleased. I took long baths. I read old poetry books someone had left on the shelf. Mary Oliver, mostly. And I let the quiet do its work. The first letter came on the second day. Courier envelope. My name written carefully in Darren's handwriting. I didn't open it, not right away. I placed it on the nightstand beside the lamp and left it untouched, like something still hot to the touch. Later that evening, after the sun had dipped behind the trees and the room was lit in golden dusk, I opened it. 4 pages, front and back. The tone was uneven, apologetic in moments, defensive in others. He said he was sorry for what he did at the table, for his words, for the slap. He said he hadn't planned it, that it just happened in the heat of things, that he was overwhelmed. that I had cornered him, that I had made it difficult. He kept circling back to Martin. How his father had pushed him. How Martin had always made him feel like love had to be earned through control. He wrote, "I didn't see it then, Mom. I didn't see how much of him I became." And then, "I don't want to lose you, but I understand if I already have." I read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt like someone was trying to hand me a map to a place I no longer needed to go. The next day, the voicemails began. Nina, her voice tight with hesitation. "Mom, I've been trying to call. I don't know what to say exactly, but I want to say something. I didn't know what Colin had planned. I swear I didn't. I thought it was just business. But I see now that it wasn't just that. It was about trust. And I broke yours." Another message later that night, Colin moved out. Temporarily, I think. I don't know what that means. Everything feels like it's crumbling. And I guess I'm realizing I leaned on you more than I ever admitted. Even when I stopped calling, you were still my center. You still are. And then a shorter one. "Even if you never speak to me again, I want you to know I still keep your birthday card on my desk." "The one from 3 years ago. You said, 'I'm always rooting for you, even in silence.' I hope you still are." I listened to each one, more than once. Not to relive anything, but to truly hear them. Their tone, their pauses, what they were saying between the words, and what they still couldn't say. None of them asked me if I was okay. None of them asked what I needed. They told me how they felt, how they were sorry, how they regretted, but not once did they say, "Tell me your side." They wanted me to come home, to forgive, to gather them again around a table and say, "It's fine. I understand." But it wasn't fine. And I had finally understood something they didn't. You don't owe people access to you just because they feel bad. Even guilt when it's convenient is still about them. Liz sent a message too. Just one. "Caleb keeps asking why Grandma isn't coming for dinner." I didn't know how to explain what happened. I told him you were resting, that you were safe. Safe. That word stayed with me, because for years I had been responsible. I had been dependable. I had been predictable, but never safe. Not emotionally, not financially, not spiritually. That's what none of them understood. I wasn't leaving to punish them. I was leaving to protect the one person who had never been protected in all of this, myself. On the 5th night, I took out the notepad from the nightstand drawer and wrote something for the first time in a long while. Not a grocery list, not a holiday plan, a letter. To me. "Dear Elaine, I remember how you learned to stay quiet so no one would call you difficult. I remember how you gave when you were empty just to keep the peace. I remember the birthdays you spent alone while your children posted pictures with friends. I remember how they used your strength like it was bottomless. I remember how you smiled through being erased. But I also remember this. You survived. You adapted. You listened. You learned. And now you acted. You didn't destroy anyone. You revealed everyone. And in doing so, you finally found her again. The version of you who stopped needing permission." I folded the letter and placed it under my pillow. No one else would ever read it. It wasn't for them. It was for the woman who waited 3 decades to be heard by the only person who truly mattered, herself. The next morning, I sat in the same window chair with my coffee wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. I thought of all the things I hadn't said. All the times I had said yes when I meant no. All the moments I laughed to keep from crying. All the times I thought love meant shrinking. And I whispered into the empty room, not to the world, not to my children, not to Martin. Just to myself, I owe no one an answer but me. And this time I meant it. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as I turned onto the winding path leading to the lake house. It had been years since I'd made that drive alone. For most of my adult life, this place had belonged to us. Not just legally, but symbolically. A shared possession, a shared past. Martin and I bought it when the kids were still small. But every summer we'd come out here packing coolers and board games, trying to remember how to be a family when work and resentment weren't in the way. And for a while we almost were. But time has a way of making everything honest. The sun was beginning to dip behind the pines as the house came into view. Still small, still strong. Its cedar siding had weathered into a soft gray, the kind of color you only earn from surviving storms. The shutters had warped slightly, and the porch sagged a bit more than it used to. But it stood. It had waited. I parked beneath the same crooked pine tree where we used to string lights for the 4th of July. The wind rustled through the needles, and I could almost hear the sound of children's laughter layered underneath it, faint like something left behind in the wallpaper of time. I stepped out, keys in hand, heart steady. No ceremony, no sentimentality, just steps. Forward. The front door opened with a low groan. Dust danced in the slanting light as I entered the air stale but not unfriendly. The scent was part wood, part stillness, part memory. I didn't rush. I walked room by room, letting my fingers drift across surfaces that once held glasses of lemonade and piles of damp towels. The couch still had that slight dip on the left cushion where Darren used to flop after swimming. The bookshelf still held the faded spine of Nina's favorite chapter book. And on the sideboard near the kitchen sat a vase. Empty now, but once filled with wildflowers the kids had picked on hikes when they were still small enough to believe I was magic. And maybe back then I was. But this visit wasn't about nostalgia. It wasn't about reliving anything. It was about reclaiming. I opened the windows one by one, letting the late autumn air breathe through the house. It smelled of pine and earth and something older than both. Something like truth. I dusted off the table, wiped the counters clean, lit a candle in the kitchen. The flame flickered against the glass backsplash, tiny but certain. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I walked barefoot down to the dock. The boards creaked beneath me just like they always had. The lake was still. Glass-like, untouched. I sat on the edge and dangled my feet just above the water, letting the cold air curl around my ankles. I remembered a birthday here. My own. The kids were teenagers, distracted, half-present. Martin had been glued to his phone the whole time, some crisis with a supplier. No one sang. I had made my own cake. But I'd smiled anyway. That was what mothers did. We filled in the empty spaces. We made the moments enough. But enough, it turned out, is not the same as belonging. And now here I was again. Older. Quieter. But not smaller. This time there was no one to clean up after. No one to prove anything to. No one to ask me for one more thing while calling it love. Just me, and the sound of wind across water. I spent the next few hours tending to small things. I changed the sheets. I unpacked the few clothes I'd brought. I brewed tea in the chipped blue kettle that still sat above the stove. I even found a small bundle of dried lavender tied with string in the drawer next to the matches. I tucked it between two folded towels. A softness just for me. As the sun disappeared behind the ridge, I cooked myself dinner. Rosemary potatoes, seared vegetables, a piece of trout I'd picked up from a roadside market on the way in. I set the table. One place. Cloth napkin. Wine glass. I ate slowly. Without distraction, without apology, not because I was lonely, but because I was home. Afterward, I stepped out onto the porch with a blanket over my lap and a second glass of wine in hand. The swing was still there, its chain rusted just enough to squeak with each movement. I sat and let the cold air wrap around me. The lake below, now a mirror for the rising stars above. I thought of the Thanksgivings past, the chaos, The planning, the ways I'd bent myself in 100 directions to keep everyone happy. And how this year I hadn't cooked for anyone but me. It was strange how full that made me feel. Not proud, not bitter, just full. The porch light glowed faintly above the doorway. The lake house in all its quiet stubbornness had not changed. But I had. And now for the first time we were a match. I didn't know what came next, whether I'd stay for a few weeks or all winter, whether Nina would ever call again, whether Darren would write a second letter, whether Martin would spiral deeper or simply disappear from public life. But I knew this much. Their futures were no longer mine to carry. Their pain was not my problem to solve, and I would no longer shrink myself to fit into their forgiveness. As the moon climbed higher, I leaned back in the swing and closed my eyes, listening to the wind trace the shoreline. They had all let this place go. But I had returned, not to fix anything, not to wait for anyone, but to begin again, on ground that had always been mine. They all left it behind, but I stayed, and I am still here. Spring crept in slowly, the way healing does. There were no sudden blooms or dramatic thaws, just quiet shifts. The frost stopped biting, the lake thawed a little more each day, and the trees that once stood bare began to whisper in green again. On one of those mornings I opened all the windows in the lake house and let the fresh air pour in, sweeping away the last of the winter stillness. It had been 6 months since Thanksgiving. 6 months since I drew the line not with my voice, but with my presence. By removing it. By choosing myself. 6 months since I'd last seen my son's face, heard my daughter's voice, or even thought about Martin without flinching. And now I rarely thought about any of them at all. The days in the lake house had begun to stretch. Not because they were slow, but because they were mine. I kept things simple. I woke early, drank my coffee wrapped in a shawl on the porch, then walked the perimeter of the property checking on the tiny shoots of herbs I had planted back in March. I read books that had sat unopened for decades. I wrote things down. Memories, questions, lists of things I'd stopped waiting for. There was a new softness to the house, not because anything had changed, but because I no longer moved with the anticipation of company or conflict. I didn't plan for guests. I didn't keep the good dishes polished or the fridge full for visitors who might never come. I lived for one. And for the first time in my adult life, that was enough. Martin hadn't contacted me again. His resignation had been quiet, his disappearance quieter. There were murmurs online, a couple of finance blogs trying to reconstruct what had happened, but most people lost interest when the headlines stopped being shocking. I heard from a friend in Boston that he'd relocated somewhere in Arizona, keeping to himself. I didn't need details. He had taken more than enough of my time already. Darren sent one more letter in March. Handwritten like the last. I never opened it. I tucked it still sealed into the back of a drawer with the first. Some answers don't need to be read out loud. Nina stopped calling after February. No voicemails. No texts. Nothing. I imagined her life had moved on, too, and I wished her peace silently from time to time without any expectation of hearing it back. The only contact I kept was with Caleb. Once a month like clockwork, he and Amber drove up the winding road in their beat-up Toyota groceries in the back seat, and a fresh batch of something sweet wrapped in foil. Banana bread. Oatmeal cookies. Apple turnovers once when Amber had extra cinnamon on hand. He still called me Grandma, and every time I heard it, something warm settled in my chest. It wasn't nostalgia. It was presence. It was real. Amber always helped me in the garden. She was gentle with the rosemary and firm with the weeds. We talked about herbs books and the value of boundaries. She never asked me about the others. She didn't need to. She'd been there in the courtroom. She'd stood up when it mattered. One afternoon in late April, Caleb and I were sitting by the dock. Amber had gone for a walk in the woods. The lake shimmered with late spring light, and the breeze was just enough to ripple the surface. Caleb sipped from a bottle of sparkling water, his long legs stretched out in front of him. Then he asked, "Do you ever think about forgiving them?" I looked at the water for a while before answering. "Sometimes," I said, "but not in the way people expect." He nodded as if he already knew that was coming. I used to think forgiveness was something I had to give or else I'd be bitter. That it was the moral thing to do, that good mothers always found their way back. And now he asked. Now, I said, I think forgiveness is just one way to close a door. And sometimes you don't need to close it. You just need to walk away from the house entirely. He didn't speak for a while. "I'm not angry," I added. "Not anymore. I don't dream of revenge. I don't wish them pain. But I don't owe them anything either. Not a conversation, not a seat at the table, not a version of me they can feel comfortable around." He nodded. That makes sense. I looked over at him, this boy who had become a man while the rest of his family was still trying to rewrite the past. I don't need to forgive people who never truly asked to understand me, I said. Not because I'm cruel, but because I finally believe I was never the one who needed fixing. That evening, after they left, I sat on the porch again. Blanket over my lap mug of chamomile tea in my hand, a small lamp glowing behind the screen door. The stars above the lake blinked slowly, patiently. The pines swayed gently like lullabies. I thought of the woman I used to be, how she ran herself ragged to earn kindness that never lasted. How she kept smiling at empty chairs, hoping one day they'd be filled with someone who saw her. She didn't live here anymore. I'd buried her not in anger but in mercy. The woman on this porch didn't ask for permission. She had already given it, to herself. And that more than anything was what peace truly was. Not the absence of pain, not the illusion of harmony, but the quiet certainty that I had chosen this life freely, fully, without begging anyone to meet me here. I sipped my tea, watched a single moth flutter near the light, and whispered into the evening, "I don't live with revenge. I live with peace. And peace doesn't ask for permission. Maybe you've been there too. Sitting at the end of a long table, holding your tongue, pretending the silence didn't sting. Maybe you've given everything for a family that forgot how to say thank you. Or maybe you're just beginning to remember your own name after years of being mom, grandma, wife. If Elaine's story stirred something in you, a memory, a wound, a quiet strength, know that you are not alone, and you are not invisible. Have you ever chosen peace over permission? Have you ever walked away? Not in anger, but in dignity. We would love to hear your voice. Share your story in the comments below. Your truth might be exactly what another woman needs to hear tonight. If this story touched you, please give it a like, subscribe to Revenge Mom Diaries, and don't forget to tap the notification bell so you'll never miss the next chapter of strength, self-worth, and silent power. Because sometimes the loudest thing a woman can do is walk away without a word. We're listening, and we're walking with you.